Kirk, a prominent figure in conservative circles, has built a considerable platform by spewing rhetoric that is, to put it mildly, deeply problematic. His pronouncements against marginalized communities, specifically his racist sentiments, his misogynistic attacks, and his venomous targeting of the LGBTQ+ community, particularly transgender individuals, are not simply unfortunate opinions. They are, in many instances, directly rooted in a warped interpretation of his biblical Christianity. Let's not mince words here. When Kirk railed against women's autonomy, when he declared that transgender people are a threat to society, or when he dismissed the lived experiences of racial minorities, he often drew from a wellspring of scripture that, in the hands of the zealous, becomes a cudgel. Consider the biblical passages that have been historically used to subjugate women, to condemn homosexuality, and to justify racial hierarchies. These aren't ancient, dusty relics. They are, for figures like Kirk, living directives, twisted into a justification for modern-day prejudice. There is a tangible harm that these words inflict. We've seen, tragically, the consequences of this kind of rhetoric. The violence that targets our judges, our democratic leaders, and ordinary citizens is not born in a vacuum. It's nurtured by a constant barrage of hate speech, amplified by powerful voices. Let's talk about Donald Trump and his MAGA base, which has become a breeding ground for this Christian nationalist fervor. Trump, a figure who claims to be a defender of Christian values, has consistently employed rhetoric that demonizes, deceives, and incites. His attacks on judges, his relentless amplification of conspiracy theories, and his dismissal of democratic institutions have created an environment where violence becomes not just a possibility, but an expected outcome. We've seen this play out in disturbing ways. The attempt to disrupt the certification of the 2020 election, culminating in the January 6th insurrection, was a stark example of how this ideology can translate into a direct assault on democracy. Trump's alleged incitement of his followers, directing them to storm the Capitol building with the intent to overturn a democratic election, is not merely political hyperbole. It is a dangerous act that sought to destabilize the very foundations of our government. Insurrection, defined as a violent revolt against established authority with the intent to destabilize the government, is a serious federal crime. And the rhetoric that fueled it, the relentless accusations of a stolen election, were amplified by figures like Kirk and the MAGA movement. It's crucial to understand that while the First Amendment protects free speech, it is not a license for defamation or incitement to violence. Defamatory speech, as we know, is a false statement of fact, communicated to a third party that harms someone's reputation. While opinions are generally protected, they become problematic when they imply false, defamatory facts or when they cross the line into direct harm. And the constant stream of false accusations leveled by Trump and his allies against anyone who opposes them, accusing Democrats of crimes they haven't committed, spreading lies that they know will incite violence. This is a deliberate tactic. It's an attempt to delegitimize and dehumanize, creating an environment where violence against these groups is seen as justifiable. Think about the election officials who have been terrorized. The judges who have faced death threats and harassment. Trump's post-election pressure campaigns against officials like former CISA Director Christopher Krebs, former Homeland Security official Miles Taylor, and previous DOJ officials, and especially his targeting of Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, demanding he bind votes and amplifying false accusations against election workers Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. This wasn't just political maneuvering. It led to a nationwide surge in harassment and threats against election workers. This is the real-world consequence of inflammatory rhetoric. It terrorizes individuals. It can lead to a mass exodus from public service, and it undermines the very functioning of our democracy. We've also seen how this ideology animates violence. The plot to kidnap Democrat governor, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, was a direct attempt to retaliate against her COVID-19 restrictions, driven by a conspiracy-minded anti-government sentiment that is often intertwined with these extremist religious views. The planning involved explosives, a desire to disrupt law enforcement. This was no joke. It was a serious conspiracy with dangerous intentions. And the threats against judges? They are alarming. Judges presiding over cases involving Donald Trump or making rulings critical of him have been subjected to an unprecedented wave of death threats, doxing, and violent rhetoric. This isn't a coincidence. Trump's own rhetoric and that of his allies often demonizes the judiciary, framing judges as politically motivated adversaries rather than arbiters of law. This creates an environment of fear and intimidation, threatening judicial independence and security. The frustration of federal judges with the Supreme Court's increasing use of emergency rulings, which they feel validates criticisms and makes them vulnerable, is exacerbated by this climate of hostility. Then there's the horrific assassination of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, who were Democrats, and the shooting of State Senator John Hoffman and his wife, also Democrat. The suspect, Vance Luther Bolter, had a list of nearly 70 potential targets and significantly had preached against abortion rights and transgender people. His views, as described by one scholar, align with the far right of Christianity in the United States. He was a conservative who voted for President Trump. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a chilling example of how hateful rhetoric can be translated into lethal action. And in the aftermath of such violence, we witnessed Donald Trump's dismissive attitude towards the victims, a stark contrast to the outpouring of grief and condemnation that would typically follow such an event. And let's talk about the tragic, and I must emphasize, the tragic death of Charlie Kirk. While his assassin, identified as a far-right conservative Republican, points to the internal contradictions of this movement, the reaction from Trump and his supporters has been predictable and frankly disgusting. Instead of acknowledging the danger of their own rhetoric, they point fingers at the liberal left. They call for action against left-wing groups, conveniently ignoring the violence that has actually occurred. They've held memorial events for Charlie Kirk and making over him in several other instances. Trump has even announced a posthumous presidential Medal of Freedom for Charlie Kirk, all the while largely ignoring or downplaying the violence against Democrats, including the assassination of Representative Hortman, the arson attack on Governor Josh Shapiro's home, the assault on Paul Pelosi, and the foiled plot against Governor Whitmer. What's more, efforts to silence any criticism of the late Charlie Kirk, including attempts to get people fired from their jobs and warnings from the Pentagon against negative comments, are deeply concerning. These actions, often framed as defending free speech, are in reality an attempt to stifle dissent, to create a chilling effect on anyone who dares to speak out against the bigotry Kirk espoused. It's a classic case of hypocrisy, demanding free speech for their own hateful pronouncements while simultaneously trying to silence those who criticize them. There's a disturbing partisan blame game underway. Despite the assassin's clear identification as a far-right conservative Republican, the narrative being pushed by Trump and his MAGA base is that the liberal left is to blame for Kirk's death. This is a desperate and cynical attempt to deflect responsibility and to further demonize their political opponents. The damage and dangers that emanate from this brand of biblical literalism weaponized for political power are immense. It fosters division, it demonizes the other, and it too often spills over into violence. It targets women, people of color, the LGBTQ+ community, and anyone who doesn't subscribe to their narrow, exclusionary worldview. As atheists and humanists, we must stand firm against this tide. We must recognize that the appeal of Christian nationalism is rooted in fear, ignorance, and a desire for a return to a mythical, exclusionary past. We must champion empathy, reason, and the inherent dignity of every human being. We must hold accountable those who spread hate, no matter how many scripture verses they twist or how many followers they command. The judges who have been threatened, the Democratic leaders who have been targeted, the election workers who have been harassed, the marginalized communities who live in fear, their plight is a testament to the destructive power of this ideology. We cannot afford to be silent. We cannot afford to be complacent. We need critical thinking. We need a commitment to factual accuracy. We need to recognize that the greatest threat to our society doesn't come from those who believe differently, but from those who preach hate and incite violence under the guise of faith. Thank you for joining me today on the Kim McPhail podcast. We'll be back next time with more critical analysis and a continued commitment to reason and humanism. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay compassionate. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please like, subscribe, and share. And bye.